Let me start by thanking you all for all the hard work, the long hours and such that you've put in the past few months. You've committed yourselves to rolling up your sleeves to help plot a recommended path that we could take to the board to address BTA's current financial challenges. As stakeholders, you have brought your own ideas to the table. You've weighed in on ideas from your fellow stakeholders. You've challenged ideas that have been put forward, and you've helped us all to broaden our perspectives. I think we've come a long way. For all of this, I am grateful. And I also want to thank you for your flexibility in having to move our November meeting. We had actually posted it. Our intentions were to move forward. However, I thought it was important to allow us to have a meeting with all three members, with Cindy, Johnny, and I all present, and we didn't have that a week ago, so that's therefore the delay by 1 week. And again, I appreciate your flexibility and short turnaround to allow us to do that. Today, you'll notice I do not have Jim Lawson to my right. Jim is out of town on a family matter, could not join us, and so CFO Raj Srinath is going to be joining us up here. So let me start with talking about what our objective is for today. It is my hope that the three members up here of the committee will have the necessary information to come up with recommendations on mitigation measures to address BTA's current financial challenges, and that we will then be able to take this set of recommendations to the full board at their December 6th meeting. If you recall, this group was commissioned by the current chair of BTA, Mayor Sam Liccardo, and December is his last meeting. So I think we are going to try and get our recommendations to him while it allows him to complete one of the items in terms of his plan for the year. So as I've done before, I do want to take a few minutes and walk through the objectives, hopefully in a way that helps us to understand how it can get us to the point that I'd like us to be at by the end of the meeting. And I will start by pointing out that we do have a hard stop at 5 o'clock. So that's going to give us 2 hours to get through the agenda, and so I'm going to be trying to manage our time accordingly. Okay, so walking through the agenda, after approval of the minutes, we are going to receive a brief update on the election results. Now, obviously enough time has passed, so most of us know this, so it'll be brief. But the reason we're doing this is, if you recall, one of the things that we have been struggling with as a body is this whole, how to speculate what was going to be happening with the outcome of Proposition 6. So now that we know that outcome, it has, bearings in terms of our path forward, in terms of, what kinds of steps we need or do not need to take. After that brief report, we're going to follow up with a presentation from Harvey M. Rose Associates. ATU commissioned a study, and I feel it is important for all of us to hear that and allow that to inform some of our discussions. Okay? After that, we will go through a proposed set of mitigation measures. So staff will be doing a presentation. And to give you an idea of what the process we are going to use is, first, staff will provide the presentation on mitigation measures that are based on all of your participation and the suggestions that we've heard over these last several months. Second, we will ask to hear from all of you, the stakeholders, in terms of hearing your suggestions, your reactions to this. And then, so that the three members we hope to hear that maybe I should read my script. And I'm sorry, I have asthma, and this air quality is affecting me, and with taking the medications and such. So if I'm a little cloudy, my apologies. So again, we're going to hear from all of you, the stakeholders. We hope to hear your suggestions so that this three-member committee can best reach a decision on what to share with the full board. After hearing from you, there will be an opportunity for my colleagues up here to ask questions, get further clarification, and then to have a discussion amongst ourselves in terms of these mitigation measures. And hopefully, by having that meaty discussion amongst ourselves, we will then be able to determine which of the mitigation measures we would like to take forward to the BTA board. Okay? So that's the process, and that's how the agenda has been designed to get us through that. And so with that, I'd like us to go ahead and get started. So the first item is, are there any recommended changes to the order of the agenda? Okay, seeing none, can I motion to approve the orders of the day?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, that was easy. It's always a race for the two of you. Who's the motion, who's the seconder, right? Okay, now that takes us to public presentation. And per our practice, we will be taking all comments at this point in time for any of the items that are on the agenda. And so if you'd like to speak, please submit a speaker card. I have one speaker. And so Roland, if you could come up, Roland LeBron, and you're limited to 2 minutes, please. And anybody else who wants to speak, please get your card in.
Thank you. So what I'd like to do is to make a small recommendation towards financial stability, is to terminate the 180 express service effective immediately. And here is the reason. So as you know, as I said last board meeting, I'm extremely satisfied with the 181 between Warm Springs North and downtown. And to be honest with you, when you extend to Berryessa, you can have a tough act to follow, because I believe it actually can take me longer than it takes me now. But the reason why I'm addressing you is the 180. And I first became aware of an AC transit line called the 217 because Google showed it to me. And Google say, well, this is how you go from Wall Street to the Great Mall. And what I did is I took a picture. I was at Wall Street Spot at 9:11 p.m. It showed a 181 at 19 and 59 minutes, which is a 40-minute headway. My question is, why do I have to wait 19 minutes? But never mind. And then I looked at the 217, which is showing me the Great Mall in 26 and 42. And to me, that looks like a 15-minute headway. So my question is, since you're getting such a wonderful service, why is my 181 going to Milpitas? Why is it taking the T2 at night? Nobody got off the bus. Nobody got on it. Milpitas was absolutely deserted. So bottom line is, I don't understand why we look at what AC Transit we're doing when we review the timetables, but we can make up for it now, terminate the 180, and let's move on. Thank you.
Thank you. That appears to be our one and only speaker. Okay, so now we're going to move to item number 5, which is the approval of the meeting minutes of August 17th.
Move to approve.
I have one correction to the minutes. My correction to the minutes is that there's no reference to a recommendation that I made to either have this committee or an alternative committee look at long-term business opportunities and business lines for BTA. I just want to make sure those are included. With that, I would second.
You accept the
Yes.
amendment?
Yes, sure.
Okay, so all those in favor of the amended minutes?
Aye.
Aye.
Great, it passes unanimously. That takes us over to item number 6, which is to receive an update on the November election results. And so I have Karen Quigley, senior analyst, to give us a brief update.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, directors and members of the committee. As Director Bruins mentioned, Prop 6 was recently solidly defeated with 56% of voters across California rejecting the measure. I should acknowledge that a broad coalition led by labor unions, affiliated organizations, business and trade associations all mobilized a well-organized campaign focusing on educating the public about how eliminating SB 1 would negatively impact safety on our roads and bridges, caused by obviously the huge statewide backlog of maintenance. As Carol will discuss later, SB 1 would provide additional funding for transit operations and maintenance, and is a huge funding source for a range of highway and transit capital projects that we'll be building in the next few years. The written report at your desk goes into some detail about the outcome of specific federal and state elections, and this year there is a connection between the two. Republican strategists had hoped that a repeal of SB 1 would help drive voter turnout for their gubernatorial and congressional candidates this year. Obviously, that hasn't worked out that way. So far across the country.
Closer to the mic.
Oh, I'm not loud enough?
Yeah,
Sorry.
please.
My apologies. Thank you. I was trying to be quick. I didn't realize. So what I was pointing out right then was just the connection between the federal and state elections this year. Republicans had hoped to use a repeal of SB 1 to drive voter turnout for their gubernatorial candidate and congressional candidates. Hasn't worked out that way, as Democrats have probably picked up 36 and potentially more congressional seats this year. The report at your desk goes into a lot more detail about some of the policy and funding issues that will be affected by the composition of the House and Senate membership and leadership next year. And I just wanted to add at the end a brief status update on Measure B. The Court of Appeal found for PTA last month and rejected Ms. Jensen's request for a rehearing. The court's ruling becomes final 30 days after November 18th. Well, actually, that would be tomorrow. And starting a 10-day window that would end on the 27th for Ms. Jensen to ask the state Supreme Court to review the Court of Appeals decision. PTA then has 20 days to file a response, arguing why the court should not spend its limited resources on the case. And then, again, the court will have 90 days after November 27th to let us know if they're going to take the case up. So we should know somewhere between late January and late February whether the Supreme Court were to work on the case.
That was your ask of us to keep our fingers crossed?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Any questions for Aaron? Thank you, Aaron. Okay, moving right along. Item number 7, on a presentation from Harvey Monroe Associates, Nicholas Menard and Severin Campbell are here from Harvey Road, and they are going to provide the presentation. Bonnie, did you want to do any introduction or anything? Or just go for it? Okay. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Severin Campbell from Harvey Road Associates, Nicholas Menard, and I work on the request from ATU to sort of look at the budget and the financial statements from the BTA, and Nicholas will give our presentation.
Hello. So like Severin mentioned, I'm Nicholas Menard on this report, and I work for Harvard Road Associates, and I just wanted to briefly introduce the firm. As you can see up here, we've been in existence since 1979. We provide analytical services primarily to state and local government agencies. We do legislative analysis, performance audits, budget analysis, policy analysis, and we were hired by ATU to independently assess BPA's financial condition. We did so primarily by looking at publicly available adopted budget documents and comprehensive annual financial statements. We also met with the BTA finance staff to clarify some questions we had about the budget prior to this meeting. So on this slide, you'll see BPA's 5-year projected operating budget deficit. At the end of the 5-year period, the projections that were prepared as part of the current budget show the operating balance at negative $25 million, with the reserves completely drawn down. And this is based entirely assuming that expenses and revenues come in at budget every single year. And we know from prior reporting to this committee that in the current fiscal year, BTA has been sort of managing this deficit by minimizing adding positions that are not related to safety, vacancy management, and refinancing existing debt. and renegotiation of investment fees. So we looked at VTA's historical performance on revenues and compared their budgeted revenues and expenditures to the actual revenues and expenditures. And what you can see is that revenues have historically come in higher than budgeted, and expenditures are less than budgeted. So even in the most recent year for which we have actuals, there was a projected budget deficit of $20 million, but the actual balance was closer to $5.7 million. And again, that's because revenues come in higher most years, the exception being in 2016, which was primarily due to federal grants not coming in as budget. In 2018, because of Measure B. So what we did was we used that historical experience to reproject the 5-year deficit based on actual expenditures and revenues that they came in 2018. We looked at VTA's assumptions for revenue growth and expenditure growth, and we saw that the revenues were projected to come in to grow at 2.5% a year. We found that reasonable and consistent with other planning bodies, and we also agreed that the expenditure growth at 3.5% a year was reasonable. And so what we found was that there's still an operating deficit in the budget, but that over the 5-year period, it doesn't fully draw down the reserves. So at the end of the 5-year period, we were projecting a higher reserve level at $19.7 million. So these are the sort of assumptions we used for the projections. It didn't, just to be clear also, it does not include Measure B money. It does not include additional state operating grants that came in higher than budget this year. It came in $12.7 million more than budgeted this year. And so with that, given that that there is an operating deficit either on the budget side or what we believe is the actual side, we tried to look at areas of the budget to identify criteria for developing recommendations to how to mitigate this operating deficit. So one area we looked at was capital projects. We looked at capital projects that were funded by the VTA Transit Fund. This is the same pot of money that can be used to fund operations. And what you'll see here is that through fiscal year 17, there was $195 million appropriated for capital projects. $66 million has been spent, or this is, excuse me, at the time of these numbers were printed in June 2017, leaving a carryover of $129 million. And then in the current budget cycle, $62 million was appropriated for capital projects from the VTA Transit Fund. So one, obviously this is a huge area of spending, and as the committee considers mitigation measures, one thing we would recommend is to sort of, or we want to introduce criteria about how to evaluate the future funding needs of capital projects, and whether there are opportunities to delay these projects and repurpose that money for operations. So the criteria would be projects that are not safety related or not part of the core transit functions, projects that have not started. If they're an ongoing project, obviously that there's just cost there to delaying something that's already, or work has already begun. And we also know that other capital planning bodies in the Bay Area are evaluating whether delaying capital projects would actually be a cost-saving measure just because of the tight labor market conditions here and sort of bids coming in high and insufficient bids being like a problem for many government enterprises. We also note that one of the mitigation measures, under consideration right now is a reduction of service, and I think that, there should be analysis done on whether, if there is a reduction in service, so capital projects that sort of would be supporting that additional service that had been previously budgeted would be necessary. So let me just take you through an example of a specific project where, although this is a sort of a small amount of money, is sort of a good example of sort of what we would sort of recommend, which is, so here's the budget for non-revenue vehicle procurement. So these are not vehicles that people pay money to use, the public pays money to use. So you can see that even though there had been $3.8 million appropriated through fiscal year 17, there was a carryover of $1.1 million, and then an additional $1.3 million appropriated in the current budget. So this is the type of project we think, it's just one example of that could be reevaluated for necessity in light of the operating deficit. And then finally, another area of savings that we commonly recommend is looking at contracted services. So VTA provided us a list of 272 professional service contracts that were enacted between 2013 and 2018. And these contracts had terms between 1 and 3 years. And so the total contract authority was over $500 million, which that's not the actual spending, that's just the amount of money that was allowed to be spent during the term of the contract. And these contracts would be supporting both the capital and operating budgets across all funds. So in our experience, contracting services are an area of savings, potentially. And so we would recommend that certain contracting services be reevaluated for their urgency, in light of the operating deficit. So number one, what we would recommend is prioritizing use of in-house staff wherever possible, which I think is, different than other recommendations made to this body in terms of contracting out services to save money. What we would recommend is evaluating when a contract service could actually be done with existing staff, and whether the work can be delayed. And also, we want to point out too that to the extent that capital projects are delayed, there would be a ripple effect in the expenditures on contracted services. And that's it.
So let me open up to questions from stakeholders first. Any questions? Okay, I'll bring it up here. Mr. Camus.
So, in your evaluation, if you go to the prior second, maybe the third slide into the presentation. Yeah, that one. Yeah. The projections that you were, maybe next one, the projections, the adjusted projections that you were making, where we don't tap into the deficit, don't tap into the rainy day fund or what have you.
No, you do.
I know. You don't tap into them as much as we had projected. Did you include the next network rollout and the increases in the service hours that we were projecting?
No, because they were based on actuals from fiscal year 18.
So even though we were projecting to increase, we have a next network plan to increase service, and so that wasn't part of the calculations.
No.
Okay. So this is based on the 1,400 or less, 1.4 million hours of service. I think that we were presented, and we were supposed to be at 1.6 million hours or something like that. Yes, yeah, that was.
Thank you. Fiscal year 18 actuals was 1.48 million service hours for bus and 153,000 service hours for light rail. Those were the actuals, where the budget was based on 1.6 million service hours for bus and 190,000 for light rail hours.
So these numbers that they're basing this off of is 1.48 million hours.
Which was the action for 18. Just,
Right.
Just, if I may, I want to add another data point to that.
Yes.
Starting January of this year, which is 6 months into the fiscal year 18, BTA started implementing next networking phases. So if you annualize the current service level, it comes up to 1.52 million service hours for fiscal year 19. That's the run rate we're at right now. And projections do not show that. That's one. The second thing, on the light rail, we are at 156,000 hours of electrical service. Again, the projection assumes service levels to be constant in fiscal year.
I do want to sort of point out one thing, though, that there are projections made by BTA the 5 years in the 17, 18, 18, 19 budget. They'd also made projections the year before. We kind of looked at the overall picture. And I think that what Nick pointed out was historically the budgets, what the budget is and what the budget projections is, are always very conservative, which is probably a good thing. I've done a lot of budget projections in my life, and you want to be conservative, but what really happens in the real world usually isn't the same thing. The revenues tend to come in higher. There are times when they don't, if they didn't in 17, 18, or 17, 18, no, 17, 18. And expenditures often come in lower because of various things. A lot of what happens is simply delays in contracts getting started, delays in positions. So I think our takeaway was we agreed with the assumptions that BTA looked at in terms of the historical experience, but we did have some differences in terms of how you look at the baseline. And so even with the revenue, sort of increases that are now being talked about for, that happened after we had this information, we thought it was a really good way to look at sort of what's going to happen in the future. And this is not exactly a cherry scenario. It's still showing an operating deficit. It's just not showing a deficit that's as deep. And I think that was something we thought was worth taking into consideration.
Yes, no, I'm not saying that this isn't a unique perspective, and I do agree with some of your ideas on non-revenue vehicles, for example, and all that, but our plan was to increase service from the 1.48 million level. Obviously, we're talking about 1.52 million this year, which obviously would skew the expenses a lot more than it's looking in this presentation. And so that's why I'm hesitant to conclude that this is a conservative scenario. I think this is a rosier scenario because we are going to be implementing the next network plan, which increases the number of service hours.
No, we would concur with you. This is definitely, we think that the BTA, this is definitely a less conservative projection
Yes.
than was presented in the adopted budget in 17, 18, 18, 19.
Yeah, so what would be, is there a, like, certain number of dollars per projected increase in 100,000 man hours? What do they, if you added 200,000 man hours, what would those numbers look like?
We have to work with BTA management to get those numbers.
Yeah, so, and that's where I'm thinking, either, my time up? Yeah, so in any case, I appreciate the presentation, but our plan was to increase that number of man hours. Obviously, it doesn't look like we're heading that way right now, but I just think we have to see that with that filter in mind.
Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to cut it off.
So, all right. So thank you very much. I just want to make sure. I'm always doing that. All right. I just want to make sure that I understand what the implications are of what you're presenting. So takeaway one for me is that the based on the outline that's before us, that while we will continue to operate in a deficit, essentially what you're saying is the deficit isn't as dramatic as we think it is, but it is a deficit. So that's one.
Yes.
Okay. And takeaway two is that what you're saying is that if we were to use a scalpel throughout the organization to make some finer point decisions, that projection may even be less dramatic than what you've prepared for us.
That would be the goal.
Okay. And then takeaway three, which I don't know if this is your takeaway, but I'm just looking at this, I'm thinking about this, is that part of what Johnny was, I'm sorry, I always never remember to use people's titles. I actually almost called you supervisor. This is how much I've been inundated with smoke today too. But if given this projection that essentially there are some issues that we have coming before us, like when BART comes online, like the next network, a number of areas where we're going to have opportunities to make decisions and choices about how we proceed and what our business line looks like. And I'm really kind of reflecting on something I heard you say a couple of meetings ago about, maintaining a certain level of service hours, but perhaps doing it in a way that's more productive than we're doing today. So if I take what you're saying to be accurate, then essentially we have some time to experiment with those business lines a little bit based on your projections versus based on what we've seen before. Do you think that is accurate?
Not being able to speak to sort of the operational decisions, what I would say is what we were seeing in the budget, the 5-year projections from the 17-18 budget, 18-19 budget, was annual deficits of $20 to $25 million, operating deficits, not talking about the drawdown on the reserve. What we saw were lower deficits incurring. They're still there, but lower deficits. That probably does give a little bit more room to move. But we can't.
Really, I'm mostly speaking about the out timeline, because I think when we look at fiscal year 2022, and by we, I'm really talking about what staff has presented before, is that the apex is sooner and a little more dramatic, and this is further, well, slightly less dramatic, but nonetheless a deficit. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so thank you two for that. So I'm still trying to understand some of the takeaway, because when you look in hindsight and you look at real-time decisions that get made either by the board or get made for us because circumstances outside of our control change, then you end up at the end of the year with some fluctuation, in particular with the size of the organization. But what I'm having a hard time wrapping my arms around is, how can we change our budgeting? I mean, when we budget, we're budgeting based on some real assumptions. So I'm trying to understand, do we need to make those assumptions that we're going to do less and therefore budget less, or do we sit here and say we're going to do Y and Y is going to cost this much, but because we know it number's quite right, we're just going to put in a different number? We're budgeting on the best information we have at a point in time. So how do we change that? Because you don't budget based on a straight line projection.
That's correct. And when I think about it, one of the things I do every year is look at budgets and do a budget analysis. And so not even speaking specifically to your budget, but speaking to what I see is sort of some common norms in public sector budgeting, is that there's service levels, there are goals, there are policy goals, there are program goals, and then there's the details of budgeting. And that's where you get into what we've talked about, positions, contracts. And one of my experiences has been that many local governments, until they are in a recession scenario, tend to budget on the upper end for contracts, or tend to budget on the upper end for positions. And positions often come in with salary savings because positions are delayed in hiring, or you have more turnover than expected, or, you know, there are various things that happen, or you decide that maybe you don't really need to make that hire, especially in like a transit organization, in non-safety, non-transit or positions or our discretion. We often find that contracts come in higher than budget. And this isn't really even talking about service levels or program levels. It's just talking about sort of that day-to-day operating of an agency where it takes longer to get that contract online than you expected. Spending on that contract happens later. So you do start seeing trends in savings. So a little bit, I think that that's some of what we were seeing here. I don't think we put on the screen, but we saw some savings sort of historically in labor costs, probably because the assumptions about how many staff you would have at any given time and what it really takes to bring them on board vary. And so we're talking about just kind of general sort of areas where we know there's some, not just discretion, but just real world barriers to getting things done quite as fast as you want them done, whether it's bringing a contract online or a position online.
Okay, so maybe Raj, my assumption, oh, actually, I'm not even sure the first one is an assumption, I think it's a statement of fact. When we budget, you know, like for positions and all, we budget with an assumed vacancy rate. We don't assume that, you know, if we're going to have 100 positions, that all 100 positions are filled on day one. We do some sort of vacancy assumption in that. Is that true?
That's correct.
Okay. And then the other thing is, I'm still, when I hear what you just said, and I appreciate what you just said, if you're looking at saying, okay, you just be a little bit more careful in terms of how you plan for when you're going to bring that contract online, when the bills are really going to come on, that's not cost saving, that's cost shifting in my mind. Am I missing something? Did I misunderstand you?
No, well, I wouldn't say you misunderstood me. I think all I'm saying is that in all the years that I've looked at budgets, it's pretty much been a common sort of thread is I look at a budget, in the budget at the beginning of the year, and then when I come back at the end of the year and look at it, that things haven't quite worked out. And I'm not even so certain that I think that it's not a good thing to make sure that you budget sufficiently so that throughout the year you have sufficient monies for your salaries and for your contracts. But that's also where you end up with year-end savings, because if you really are budgeting conservatively at this end, the real world doesn't tend to act like that. And so I don't think that leads to cost shifting so much, and I don't think it means reductions in services. I'm just saying that usually there's a little bit of a barrier, between what you think is going to happen and what really happens.
Okay. To keep management of time, sorry if we took our fair share. Mr. Hendricks, you have a question?
I just, wanted to take kind of a macro picture of what I take away from this. I just wanted to ask real quick, the difference of what was VTA's projected budget versus what you came out, was that 1 or 2% difference? On an annual basis of what you said? I'm just looking at the numbers and they're not.
No, it's more than that. So if you look at the operating balance here, it's $20 to $28 million.
I'm talking about the total budget, the percentage.
Oh, I see. I see.
The percentage difference between what VTA's number is and your number is a couple percent? It's a couple percent.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, and what I would just say at a macro level, those are within the margins of errors. And what I take away from this is that here, you've reinforced and confirmed the concern we have is that we have a problem. That's what I get, is independent confirmation of a problem. As you've heard me say before, in the city of Sunnyvale, we do 20-year budgeting. So the fact that we're talking about whether or not we might run out of money in 4 years or 6 years or 7 years, that's still a problem of what we have. And I think some of the ideas of how we look at how we can do things along the way are appropriate. But this is just confirmation we have an issue. We need to go ahead and be on top of this. And like I said, whether or not our current projections show we've run out in 4 years, or you take that out, maybe it's 6 or 7 years, it's still a problem that we need to go ahead and work on. And to me, that's the independent confirmation message that I get out of what this is. The actual numbers and stuff of, I can make different projections of rosy or not rosy out a couple of years. I think this just confirms we have an issue and we're not off by borders of things. That's my thinking.
Well, I appreciate that, because I think that's what I was seeing, and I'm trying to figure out. And do you agree with that assessment that was just given? there's a
Yeah.
problem, it's just a matter of whether it's in 2022 or whether it's in 2024 type of thing?
I would say, and I think that we kind of have been saying this, I would agree, we are still showing a deficit. We are just showing it not occurring as quickly and as deeply.
Okay. Did you want to make a comment? Otherwise, we're going to move forward.
Yes, first of all, I want to thank auditors. I mean, they did an excellent analysis of this. Thank you. In fact, we did meet with them, provide some of the numbers for this. A couple of things, I just wanted to provide some context of color, so that may help from the The board approved a certain service level. We have to cost based on what the board approved. Let's say the board approved 1.6 million service hours. We just cannot cost a service at, let's say, 1.4 or 1.45, thinking, you know what, we're not going to deliver that kind of service. That's one. The second thing, I just want to note, maybe you mentioned it, maybe I missed it. 2018 revenues were lower than the budget, by the way. It's over the expectation. One other thing I just want to note, these are just the operating deficits we're talking about. There is another piece which we've talked about pretty much at every meeting on this subject, which is the local share of the capital. If you include that, the numbers would be different. I also realize we did not get 2016 Measure B, and you're rightfully excluded that. You've made a comment. If we get that, the revenues will be higher. So, I mean, there are kind of puts and takes in both revenues and expenses. We have to budget based on whatever the service levels that were approved. It cannot be for anything less than that. And the vacancy rate and all that, yes, we do have historical things. We do assume a certain vacancy rate. Up to some extent, we can manage that. So those are just the comments I wanted to make. Again, thank you very much for.
Anybody else have any other comments or questions? So I want to say thank you very much. I really do appreciate this. And it does kind of confirm the order of magnitude, but there is a structural problem that we have someplace here, so we've got to deal with that. And appreciate some of your suggestions and ideas as well. So thank you. Anything else? Okay. That's going to move us to item number 8. Basically the last item on the agenda, but where we are going to be spending our time. And so Carol Lawson is going to come up and present to us a set of recommendations for how to address the structural deficit and to promote the long-term financial stability. And just to reiterate the process, we're going to hear from Carol, then we're going to receive feedback from the stakeholders, and you guys all get the floor at that point. And then we're going to basically turn to the committee for discussion, and then I'm going to keep my fingers crossed that one of my colleagues will be planning to make a motion on what we would be taking to the board in the December meeting. So that's going to be the process. So committee member, you're going to hold your third in line. Got it?
Got it.
Okay. Thank you, Jean. Go ahead.
Okay, so the first part of this will seem like same song, second verse. We'll reiterate that based on what we budgeted in FY18 and 19, and if you include the fact that we need to fund a capital state of good repair program, that we were looking at a $50 to $60 million per year deficit at full impact. And by full impact, I mean when the full 1.6 million bus hours that we were referring to and 192,000 light rail hours get implemented. So it's made up of those two pieces, the budget operating deficit of 26 million, and that's based on the FY19 budgeted numbers, which again included that full on service levels, more service, more costs, less service, less costs. And then also the 30 to 35 million of local share of capital need for capital program going forward. The mitigation measures that we'll talk about today were identified based on discussions and suggestions from this committee. board direction that we received at the time of the FY18 and FY19 budget adoption. What the implementation schedule is, it needs to be relatively short. While the Harvey-Rose presentation showed that if you use FY18 as a base, the reserves last you a year longer than what we showed. That does not include the capital piece, and that also does not anticipate any additional service. So if we go forward with the service that's planned, when BART comes online, then the reserves go away in less than 2 years from that point in time. It goes to negative at that point in time. The financial impact for those exact reasons need to be relatively immediate and ongoing. Another thing I will point out, the suggestion of going through the capital program and deciding which are critical pieces and which aren't. I'm not saying that that's not a valid exercise, but what I will say is those would be one-time savings of some kind if we decided not to use them on capital. It wouldn't be long savings that could provide dollars for an ongoing service increase or any of those types of annual expenditures. This list of mitigations does exclude any items that require collective bargaining. So there's basically 3 categories here. One is incremental revenues that we now know more about based on Prop 6 outcome and a couple of other things. And so basically there's no VTA action required for those items, but they do help go towards the $50 to $60 million deficit. Second item is service delivery levels. We did hear exactly everything you said last time about not cutting service. So we have a second option listed here, which I'll go over in a minute, which is a little bit of a compromise, but a better solution we think at this time. And then the third category is addressing fares and then like a miscellaneous other, to be honest. Okay, so the no VTA board action required. SB1 is here to stay, at least for now. And we are currently showing annual projected revenues, and this is incremental from what was assumed in the 18 and 19 budget, from $23 to $27 million. And there's a couple of reasons there's a range here, and there's also a very good reason why this number is higher than what we had presented before. MTC has given us estimates all along of what they thought our revenues would be. Part of the reason these have gone up from in the most recent estimate that we got is because the money that we get, the ST money we get is based on a tax on diesel. And in the last year, the price of diesel has gone up about 30%. So initial estimates of how much we would get were much lower because they were based on diesel prices at that point in time. Now they have gone up. There are also other components of this that at the time that we had the original estimates, those items hadn't been finalized by MTC. They have been now, so they have also been added into this range. I caution that the diesel issue is a double-edged sword. Almost, maybe I could say it's a triple-edged sword. Yes, we get more STA when diesel goes up. We also get less STA money when diesel goes down. And we also, because we run diesel buses, at least some of them are hybrid diesel, but they're still diesel, we also pay more when diesel goes up. The second item here we discussed last month. Oh, that wasn't last month. It seems like last month, or a long time ago. The last time we met, which was in August, I apologize, was the full sales tax collection on online purchases. I'll just quickly, there was a state Supreme Court ruling that online purchases are taxable even if the business does not have a physical presence in the state. Our sales tax consultant believed that there will be about a $5.5 million impact for us, but it will take up to 2 years for the state to catch up to all of the things that needs to happen for all of those to be collected. So those are the two items that, you know, we basically don't have to do anything. It's either already happening or will happen. Those, if you look at the range, is about roughly $28 to $33 million, if I round. So if we take those off of the beginning point, so we were at 50 to 60, if you take off those two pieces, the remaining target is roughly 25 million. I kind of cut the range down the middle in all options, and just to get us to a kind of a number that we kind of is our target. So service delivery options. Option one is what we presented at the last meeting. It would reduce bus hours below what is currently provided, and also would be light rail at slightly less than what we're currently provided. The intention here is that this would take, we would still implement the concepts of Next Network to the greatest extent possible. And I'll talk about those a little bit more when I get to the second option here. If we were to do that, it would be a $30 million savings off the base of what we had assumed with the 1.6 million hours. And the next slide has some context here with all of the service hours next to each other, which will help kind of with a little bit of a comparison. The second option that we are presenting here is to still implement the Next Network concepts, but within our currently provided service levels. So it wouldn't be the exact service that we're providing now, so not the exact same route schedules, time frames, but with that level of service in total. So about 1.52 million bus hours and 156,000 light rail hours. The Next Network, I got the board memo here from when it was originally passed. The goals were to reallocate transit service from low ridership areas to high ridership areas, increase frequencies, have more rapid routes, increase midday and weekend service levels, and expand hours of service, have stronger connections to regional transportation, and expand the rider base and improve the service for current riders. Our transit planning staff have looked at what was provided in the initial Next Network span of routes and frequency and timings, and believe they can make that work essentially within the 1.52 million bus hours that we are producing now, just by putting more service on the higher ridership core routes and lowering, and it does require eliminating some routes that was part of the Next Network plan as it was presented originally. The challenge with this level is the light rail hours. The 192,000 that was presented as part of the Next Network plan had a basically new line that went from Santa Teresa to Mountain View across the top, and that was additive. That service will be important to serve the BART station at Milpitas, because we'll have people coming in from there that will need to get to employment locations in North County. So in this case, it wouldn't be able to be additive. It would require some tweaking in the existing service to be able to add that service, but not increase the total service hours. So that will be a challenge. It's something that we would have to continue to look at, and when BART service does start, look at what the service needs are, the ridership needs are, and go from there. This option saves $14.7 million off of the original FY19 full-on plan. So as I mentioned, here's some context. As Raj mentioned earlier, in FY18, we provided 1.48 million bus hours. The adopted budget for 19 was 1.6. The two options I just presented, option one would actually be a reduction from what we're operating right now. Option two would be a little bit more than FY18, but that's because we added some service in January. So basically, mitigation option two is roughly the service level that we are currently providing in FY19. On the light rail side, FY 18 actual was 153, we budget was 192. The original mitigation option 1 was 150, and right now we're at 156, which is pretty close to what we're operating right now. The next category, or I'm sorry, this is now the third category, was the first item was to index fares to inflation. We did admittedly had a fare increase last year in January, and we'll have the second piece of that this year. But I would like to point out it had been 8 years before that since we had instituted a fare increase. We think it would be better, quite frankly, if we found a way to index it to something and have it be a recurring standard part of the policy, so that it's something that everybody expects to come, knows it's coming, and it's better for everyone from that standpoint, perhaps. The projected annual savings here would be initially about $2 million, and this would obviously depend on what inflation did and when we did it and how far reaching across our fare media it is. That dollar amount of annual would increase as fares are re-indexed because it would be compounded. The last item is something that we had discussed earlier also would be a voluntary early retirement incentive. It would be for, well, it would depend how we would roll it out. But the estimate here is based on a assumed rate of uptake to a eligible employees in a 3 to 6 month time frame. So again, it would be about $1 million. Part of that savings would be because some of those positions potentially would not need to be replaced. Some of the savings would be because could be from the replacement being at a lower wage and benefit level. That is the end of what I have for today. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, stakeholders, questions, comments, reactions, and Mr. Hendricks?
So I'll go ahead and start. I don't have any questions. I think it's all pretty clear about what it is, but if you want to hear what my thoughts are on the different choices, I'd be happy to go ahead and share them with you. So going back to, I'll just go through in the order that they were. The SB1 revenues, yes, I think we should go ahead and take them. Wait to proceed. Who's going to say no to that? Being able to go and do the full sales tax collection on online purchases, yes, but I think that's probably even longer than the 2-year cycle of what we're thinking that might really take right there. But clearly being able to increase revenue sources, I think that's an appropriate thing to go ahead and do. On the service delivery options, there was an option 1, option 2. I don't suggest the option 1, which is reducing service levels down. We've been through that before. Some of us have sat through all the meetings on the next gen discussions and what people's perspectives were on that, so I don't think that's a good thing to do. It's find a way to take the service hours we thought we were going to do, which is not a reduction, and maximize as much service to our customers as we can. Now, there might be one additional feature that could go with this, which is potentially the board could give additional flexibility to management to be able to make some of, to look at those as a range. It's kind of been what management's done. They said, here, this is what was, you couldn't quite get there. But maybe there could be more direction by the board to give management a little more flexibility in how they allocate or choose to use those service hours. And there should continue to be more focus on identifying low ridership lines. There's already a policy by the board that certain, if you're below a certain ridership here, we're going to go ahead and potentially look at a change. Maybe that needs to be a little bit more focused, because that might be an area where you get some of the flexibility in how those service hours could be used. Indexing fares to inflation. I don't think you want to go ahead and do that. I was in the meeting where we went ahead and raised the fares, and they said, oh yeah, but we can't do it on this. Maybe if you could say here, every year you're going to make sure in the budget meeting, there's going to be a discussion of what fares are, so the board has the ability to make the decision, and it's always there to be decided. But I think to go ahead and just say here, we're going to make a flat policy decision, and out in the future, this is how it works. I think that takes certain flexibility out of, and responsibility out of the board's hands, but making it that it has to be every year a budget level discussion, I think that might be a way to help try and address that. The early retirement incentive, as long as it's all pure voluntary, I don't, if you don't like it, you don't take it. But I think the important thing to understand is that these changes or recommendations are not the end. I think the board is going to have to take much more time and be more focused on the budget every year, trying to look a little bit farther out. I think that one of our recommendations is trying to look 10 years out of what's going on with the budget. We've already seen there are clearly things on the horizon that have to be dealt with. And the board has to spend more time focused on this, looking at what, and trying to understand what are the potential parameters that could be changed, and they have the ability to adjust, to be able to give that direction to management and to the finance system. So it's kind of almost a yes, 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 yes.
With a no on fair. With a no,
Well,
it's a variation on that.
It's make sure it's an item that you have to address.
An annual discussion,
Yeah.
not an automatic
Yeah.
adjustment. Okay? You want to just go down the line? Or, I'll tell you what, I'm going to do it based on whose lights on. I'm going to go over to this side now. Don't turn yours off. Okay, so thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So first I just want to, oh, perfect, thank you. Just want to point to our little document I put together that sort of looks at some of the recommendations that staff has put forward, as well as a lot of the comments and information that were gathered throughout this process, I think, over the last year. Tried to focus on things that I think are balancing both the our capital and operating needs, but also sort of trying to stick to things that are that could be done within 2 years, and that focus on financial responsibility, on financial accountability, and still try to do, I think, what is the focus of DTA's mission, which is obviously helping to move people around the county. So first, obviously, I think, you know, we got lucky on November 6th. A lot of folks worked really hard. I think business and labor came together to help make sure that Prop 6 didn't blow a hole throughout our roads and our budgets. So that's really great to see that revenue there. Seeing the sales tax revenue pass as well is also really helpful. But again, we didn't have to do anything really on that. And so looking at the other solutions, I'm just reminded to first when I saw the chairman call for this committee, and thinking back to the first meeting that we had, right? And just thinking about what it was that we were tasked to do, right? And I think I remember, I think, having I hate to say it, a sense of hope, right? A really serious sense of getting a lot of folks from the business side, from labor, from the community, as well as members from the board, to get together and really try to tackle some of the really sort of underlying structural issues that we're dealing with at DTA. And so I think we saw a lot of presentations about what peer agencies are doing. We saw a presentation about the future of transportation. We got multiple presentations on the main cost drivers of our system. And I'm looking at these suggestions here, and what I'm seeing is maintaining planned service, or maintaining current service levels, raising fares, and offering early retirement. And it just seems like we are still sort of short of some of the ideas that have been surfaced both by staff and by members of this committee to help tackle some of these underlying drivers. Because what I'm worried about is that we look at the solutions that are currently in the staff proposal and sort of pat ourselves on the back and say we did our job and we'll be back here in 3 years, right? And that's a worry. And I understand that the other suggestions that I'm making further down the document that you have in front of you are a little bit more difficult to tackle. But I think we have the opportunity to use this committee and to use the fact that we all came together and worked on this for over a year to help the full board start to tackle some of these issues. So I don't want to go through the entire list right now. I want to let some of my fellow members of the committee speak, but I just hope that we are going to broaden the recommendations that we want to make to the board.
Well, I have some thoughts.
Okay, we'll come back to that. Okay. I'm going to give all you guys a chance to speak, and then accept. And my colleagues up here will get their chance to ask clarifying questions. Carl, Mr. Bardino, you have your microphone.
Thank you.
Thank you. For the record, that wasn't me.
I would say, how many of these meetings have you attended? Are you just here about making a presence, your presence known?
Well, I've been booked for 4, 2 were canceled,
Okay.
and 2 were not. Thank you, Madam Chair. As I look at this, I'm reminded of a jigsaw puzzle. Every piece is important and every piece has to snap into place. And it's not going to be just one solution, it's going to be multiple solutions. Some of those are harder than others. Some will be on the revenue side and some are going to be, as we heard, on the cut side. And that's how we're going to make this work. I do want to comment on Prop 6, though, and thank you for your comments. We didn't get lucky. I've found that the harder I work, the luckier I get, to quote different folks. That effort in 58 counties, led by the California Alliance for Jobs, a labor-business partnership, we were blessed that while running the Prop 1 and 2 statewide housing bonds totaling $6 billion, which we co-led, they asked if we'd run the Bay Area effort for defeating Prop 6. So just to give you a sense that wasn't luck, that was hard work. My colleague Matthew Quevedo, sitting in the front row, and 4 of our colleagues took 75 straight days on loan to co-run those 3 state campaigns. And on the Prop 6 side, that included more than 60 presentations. It included 46,000 individual contacts with students at 7 campuses to make sure we drove the student vote. It included nearly 20 employee town halls at companies throughout the region to make sure that those thousands and thousands of workers knew what was at stake. 6, 7 key metrics, all achieved and exceeded, drove that lucky outcome because of hard work. I would mention that as we look at the items that Raj communicated, the fare increase item, indexing for inflation, is so important. Isn't that the lesson we just learned from Proposition 6? That we had not indexed for inflation, let alone change the gas tax revenue for nearly a quarter of a century. That's why we have crumbling bridges and roads throughout the state, a lack of transit alternatives, congested roads, because we've neglected it for 25 years by not having the wisdom to adjust it for inflation. So that step alone is never easy, but VTA provides a service that is worth it, and that if we don't adjust for inflation, we just make it harder to achieve these goals, to maintain a system that we're all proud of and that we want to make sure stays viable for everyone who needs it in our region, especially those who are transit dependent. So I want to thank Jeannie and Supervisor Chavez and Councilmember Camus for your dedication to this effort, but let's remember it's going to be a jigsaw puzzle approach to get this done. Steve and I are sharing the mic, showing the business-labor partnership of this family.
So I want to make a couple points. The first one is, I think you mentioned that capital projects is a one-time savings. And I think that's true in one sense, but I think the mistake we've made as an agency is we approve capital projects and we don't account for the state of good repair and the operating costs associated with those projects. and those aren't built in. This is a perfect example. We sit here, and with all the monies that have become available, if we had accounted for the other 25 million of capital costs, we'd be even right now. And I think that's really important when we approve capital projects, that we account for the state of the repair and the operating costs, and that those costs go into the budget and are accounted for over the long term. The second point I want to say is when we look at the contracting costs, I think that's an area that we could really save a lot of money in reducing the costs in contractors and putting those jobs, that work, into current employees.
Who's next? Christine?
Thank you. As we look at this, this is a giant widget, and like any widget, that you have to find the balancing point. You have to know the market, you have to know the people involved, you have to know the timelines. All those are very important things. The biggest thing in my mind anyway is the safety and the ability for people to have quality transportation, even if they can't drive for themselves, whether they're taking fixed route or not, whether they're taking paratransit or not. The critical thing, and as my on the side of myself, the advocate is saying, to make sure that we're serving the people that need to be served. We don't lose routes that have to be there, that need to be there, such as the route to Gilroy. Gilroy people should not be cut off, but it is a balancing act. And I can well appreciate the efforts and energies that have gone into researching and demonstrating alternative ideas to this very complex issue. Assuming that the idea of having a future system based on battery operated vehicles is an interesting concept, but let's get through this stage first. I agree. Some of the capital campaigns and different initiatives that have been thought of and pursued, perhaps some of them can be highlighted for the time being. As if this were a household, certainly you have to look at what is the most critical thing to have the household run correctly first. Whether or not you have the color TV or the Wi-Fi or whatever, at the very bottom of it, it has to be a solid household. Right now, from what I'm hearing, from what I'm seeing, that's not there. We need to work on it. Thank you.
Good luck. Come on, Raj.
I think most of the items that have been proposed, either by BTA or by our consultant, seem well, but I'd like to perhaps make one more suggestion. Whether it applies here or not, that's up to the board. But, you know, most transit agencies need to start looking at demand-based pricing. And what I mean by that is that during the rush hour, you know, your pricing for using BTA system could potentially be higher. And at the times where the demand drops, you cut the service as well as reduce the pricing. The whole idea here is to make sure that our buses and our trains are not running empty, which happens to be the case at least during the non-peak hours, you know. And I'm saying both for buses and the light rail system. That's one. And the second is that the savings that have been indicated in the BTA report for voluntary retirements, I think it's a little low. There is, just in talking to, staff at BTA, and I'll just take, our division, design and construction. There's several people who would love to retire if a proper incentive is provided. And so I'm looking at that savings to be way more than $1 million. Of course, like Carol said, that those positions should not be filled immediately, at least at that level. Perhaps the workload should be shared for some time, and that if necessary, a lower level position should be generated and filled. That is going to at least help reduce labor costs to some extent, if that's one of the concerns. That's it.
Okay. Anybody on this side? Ryan?
Sure.
Ryan, I have to comment real quick. You're identified as one of the alternates. And I don't know, are you one of these people that say, I go for the alternate so that I don't have to be there all the time? Yet somehow, I have to, did you get suckered into this? Did somebody sell you a bill of goods?
Something like that. No,
we appreciate, actually, seriously, I appreciate as an alternate.
no, the
stability.
standing member actually is there off and lives in way out.
Okay. No, I appreciate the fact that we had stability with you being here all the time, even as our alternate. That was great.
No problem. As I listened to everything, read over this, I'm actually a little disheartened, right? Because I haven't heard any fixes to get the house in order, right? Everything's being kicked down the road, everything's shaved off, we're gonna save money here, but we still have this structural deficit, right? And the one word that, stands out to me is inflation. And what are we doing to solve that across the board, right? Prices go up, wages go up. All I hear is, in my mind, all I'm seeing is people say, well, we gotta cut wages, we gotta cut the labor force. But without the labor force, BTA is not running, period. And people don't see that, I guess, right? So I'm stuck with more questions than anything about how can we really make the hard choices and really get this house in order to sustain ourselves for the foreseeable future. Because the way I see it, how are we here in 15 years? How are we here in 20 years? Any of us. So this is all I see. I don't know. That's all I have.
Okay.
I have a procedural question.
Yes.
What would be the best way to surface suggestions to the committee members? I don't know if that's a vote, proposal, sure.
So what I'd like to do is so I was asking for a couple things, I'm sorry if I wasn't clear. One is reaction to the recommendations that staff has put on the table. New ideas that you want on the table, or both of them. So I'm hoping that you are going to go through your list. But maybe before you do that, if we can hear any other comments and such so far, and then I'm going to bring it back over here because you've got an organized list, and I think that might give us a methodology for going through it. Is that okay?
Yeah, this is my first meeting, so I don't have the history. I had to take over for somebody else that wasn't going to make it today. But the only way to increase revenue is to increase the level of service. And over the last 25 years, our level of service has gone down. Now, I know we're kind of depending on the next gen to help, but we really do need to concentrate on somehow getting that level of service back up. It's the only way we're going to increase our revenue. So.
Can I respond to that?
Sure.
Just quickly. One of the tenets of Next Network is to increase where the service is to higher ridership areas. So I would make the counter argument, if you will, that it's not necessarily more service that's important, it's the quality and type of service that you provide. So, and the reason I bring that up is I think Raj mentioned earlier that we had implemented some of the Next Network, the pieces that weren't all tied together. Next Network is called that for a reason. A lot of those changes are all tied to each other, so it's hard to parse off little pieces of it, but we have started implementing things in phases. And the first phase of that was in January, and it was improvements in frequency on 3 different bus routes. And calendar year 2018, so January through October, those 3 bus routes have averaged 14% better ridership than they had last year in that same time period. So I say that to kind of illustrate my point that if you can take your service time and put it towards more frequent service in higher core areas, then you can get higher ridership but still have the same level of service hours. So it's not necessarily more hours that solves it, it's the kind of hours that you provide.
I come by this gray hair honestly. So over the years, I've kind of gotten a little bit more cynical with life. And I'm looking at the Bay Area where I see people moving out, farther out, because they can't afford to live here. And when I looked at the Next Gen service maps, I saw where we were cutting service in the outlying areas, the further out. So the people that need to get in to do the service jobs, the lower paying jobs, it's going to cost them more for transportation, and it's going to be more difficult for them to get into the cities. Again, that's my overall take. What is the answer? I don't have it. Again, with the gray hair comes a little bit of senility, I guess, and I don't have the answers.
This must be a solution-oriented group, okay?
I understand.
Yeah.
Well, I think when this first started, I said that I was one of the people with Raj and Sadiq. This is our second time around with this committee. And so I guess it's just, I feel like it's just like the same thing over and over. And we don't ever learn that we're supposed to know how much money we're going to have when we build a project and how much money, when we go ask taxpayers for money, which we have done several times in my 23 years, that we know what we're going to use for operating costs in that money. I mean, at some point we have to learn from our mistakes, and I don't know that we're doing that. I would say that I'd support option 2, and I would support increasing the fares tied to inflation. I mean, our #1 complaint we get from our employees is, well, can we not get the little 2% raise? Can we at least get something tied to inflation? So I'm not going to not support fares tied to inflation, because I think that's probably more a fair place to be, and also for us to be a legitimate business trying to do the right thing. I feel like when you look at the list, I don't know if this is a dumb question, but is this 161 million or billion that we spend on contractors? Might be a dumb question, but.
Million.
Okay, so either way, it's a lot of money. In the beginning of the process, I agree with some of my colleagues here that we talked about all these ways that employees are saying they don't track how much time they spend on a project. So we don't really know if these projects are using the project money or operating cost money to work on projects. And so we need to have better ways to track that in-house. We need to improve those types of things. If we really are gonna, be able to get the full amount from our operating costs. Those kind of things I think that we should really think about, and maybe not having contractors that work here for 5, 15, 20 years, but have special project employees that truly work on that project, and then they're gone after that. I think that's the only way we're going to be able to really improve and focus on what's our operating system, and if we are going to get into having to pay into the BART system, we should be realistic about how much money we're spending and what we really have, because are we going to get to a point where like 75% of our budget is going to BART? I mean, that's the worst case scenario that employees repeat to us, and we reassure them that the board has better control of that. But I want to be realistic and say that that's what I think we need to be watching out for. So, I mean, there's a lot of things. I just don't feel like we used our time like we said we were going to, and really look into all these other things, because we brought in a lot of other suggestions, and all it comes down to is the next network and some parent uses. So I guess I'm a little disappointed, but I did want to give my suggestion anyway.
Thank you. Another comment over here? Any comments?
I have a comment here. So 2 areas of concern. One is what Tammy just said about consultants. Now, I'm going to be very vocal about this in this meeting, at least this time around. We have, for years now, tried to point out to VTA that there are consultants that have a permanent office at River Oaks. I mean a permanent office. I've been here 18 years. I've seen those consultants for 18 years, and I've been told they have been here several years prior to that. My question to VTA is, we're always told that we hire consultants for specialty work. Can we not have our own staff do what some of these consultants have been doing, or have our staff trained or educated to get this work done in-house? As you all know, that we always pay consultants way higher than a VTA employee. So the question is, if a consultant is here for as long as a VTA staff is here, what is the savings we get? 0. We're paying way more. I think this is a serious concern that the board is going to be brought to the board's attention every single meeting, that at least we get a chance to, voice our opinion on.
Okay. So I think we had a hard stop at 5, so I'm going to look at the clock now. And so,
one more quick comment. In this whole scenario that we have discussed, there is no attention given to what increases in compensation VTA staff is going to be getting. I don't see those numbers here at all. Is there any projection? Because either there's an assumption made that the current ATU negotiations will yield no increases. Next year we have other groups, AFSCME and Group I lead. So we need to account for all those things. Otherwise, we're always going to be in a hole, regardless. So I think we need to take a holistic approach to this, looking at all the expenses that we're going to incur from a year-to-year basis. I hope, living in Silicon Valley, we'll be able to afford to live here. Otherwise, like Herman said, we might be moving out too.
okay. So what I'm going to do is, anybody who has not spoken, if anybody feels compelled to make a comment, react to the options that were placed on the table by staff.
Sure. Don't know if I'm compelled to speak, but I think everyone's had great ideas and input. The issue's probably
I need you
pretty
to
well
pull up to the microphone.
The issue's pretty well characterized, I think, at this point. If you look at the projections, it's obviously that there's this operating balance, and the operating balance is getting larger each year. It's getting to a sizable balance even on these more conservative projections. Great service is really important. Providing a service that people want to pay for and use is really important. It should be the underlying goal, but it's got to be done more efficiently. It's not, I think every person has had great input. I can appreciate what was just said, that as someone that looks at numbers all day and analyzes balance sheets and income statements, it's impossible for me to really make recommendations off of the expenses that are listed here. They're not really broken down If they were broken down, we could probably make better guesses, but that might not be the job of this group here. But issues will characterize, there's a larger deficit, it's growing.
Kyle? Okay, so if there's no one else wants to speak, what I'm going to ask Lisa, can you, in like 3 minutes, get through what your list in terms of what you have in front of us so that we can hear what you're saying, suggesting that you would like this
Or
committee?
did you do, I thought you did it already, but.
I don't think you did you?
A little bit, but yeah, a little bit. One thing I'll just do is maybe prioritize and just like put it in big blocks of things. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So three of the items, especially under the financial actions, are already existing programs. The suggestion is simply just increasing either the speed or the scale of those programs. So for the Express Lanes program, it's already an existing program, just needs to speed up. The joint development program, that $2 million is actually conservative. There's an estimate that it's going to be $6 million by 2024. Hopefully, it's at least $2 million by 2021. And then the contracting cost reduction, that's just a very normal, basic management best practice of reviewing every single contract and doing a contracting audit to figure out which contracts are we need to prioritize. So all of that, everything in that first section is existing programs that just need to be implemented more quickly, right? And I would love for the board to be able to consider that at the same time that they're considering these other suggestions that staff has put forward. On the policy changes, those are a little tougher and they take a little longer. I understand that some of them were put in the parking lot at the last meeting as something that would be sent out to different either ad hoc or standing committees. But I do want to highlight a couple of things because they would need to be done more quickly. So one of them is around the Next Network. I know Carol just mentioned that there was going to be a prioritization around high-frequency lines. I would like there to just be a standard set that we're going to be setting the frequency coverage equation at least 90% frequency and then 10% coverage. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of negotiations around where that's going to be shifted, but just setting a standard. And then the second thing would be to incorporate the light rail speed improvements, the fast network, the fare payment improvements, as well as the bus stop improvements into one large just transit forward program to where all of these separate different silos could be presented into one cohesive package to improve service overall. That's just a very quick today suggestion. And then I would also would like for the board to consider either the legal or the legislative feasibility of future new sources of revenue. I'm being agnostic about where the revenue comes from or what kind of revenue is going to, whether it's going to be a state source, if it's going to be a local source, if it's going to be a regional source. I know there's a lot of talk about potentially having a very large regional measure that's going to be, all throughout the 9-county Bay Area. I just want to make sure that we are considering all of these options for the next 2 to 4 years.
Thank you. Okay, so what it's 4:38 now. So what I'd like to do is turn it over to my colleague up
I
here.
want to try to make a motion.
And Cindy's got to start to give us something to work from.
And this motion's going to be a little bit long, but I'm going to try to start with what the staff is recommending, and then I'll move off the staff recommendations to my own.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you to make sure that microphone is all here.
Thank you. Under the level of service, I wanted to support option 2 with a goal of 90-10 that looks at maximizing ridership. That's first. Second, on fares. I'm going to recommend that the staff consider a fare policy that assumes annual increases with a recognition that we have to focus those increases based on the type of fares.
And so let me just say 2 more sentences about what I mean by that. I think that Glenn's right, that the board needs to be able to annually assess whether or not the increase is appropriate. But it may be appropriate to increase certain fares incrementally and perhaps not do the same thing with senior fares. But the board needs to, special needs communities, but the board needs to have that discussion so that the assumption is that there's an annual increase, but that we're assessing where and when that's appropriate, but it's an annual discussion. Third, on the section that was voluntary retirement, I want to support that with 2 additions. One is that I would like the staff to consider options for buyouts and consider this as part of restructuring VTA for long-term service provision. And I just want to give an example. When budgets get tough, one of the first things organizations do is we cut marketing and communication. I don't know why we do it. It's like the last thing you should do, but that's what happens. But in some instances, as we rebuild VTA, we may want to invest more money, for example, in marketing and less money in something else that we're doing. If we do structured targeted buyouts, it may give the board the flexibility to make future long-term decisions based on what VTA's book of business is. Then I want to, on something that I think Carol touched on, that I want us to examine in a wholesome way the base of funding we currently use for VTA. And that includes looking at sources of money that are fungible and that should be aligned to new types of, again, business. So for example, in the past, we used one source of Measure A funding. I think Carl and Bob went to court together to create that opportunity for us. But we should look at all sources of funding for that sort of fungibility for the long-term health of the organization. On another item that has come up as long as I've been on this board, and we've never seriously done it, is to examine the opportunities for contracting in, and that be done through a shared process that could include board members, labor management, but really the intent here is to use every dollar as effectively and efficiently as possible. And not, sometimes when things are moving fast, we throw money at consultants and not do the internal examination to determine whether or not we can handle that internally. Second, that we do have recommend to the board that the auditors take a look at our ability to properly account for billing of staff to capital projects. I'm sorry, I'm reading my own writing. Consider options for the board to further analyze the future of VTA. And what I mean by that is whether it's through this committee or through a board committee, that we be tasked with, to quote Ronnie, make hard choices. But that be done in the context of all of the direction that's given here today, because it really does need to be, again, a very wholesome process. And that would be my motion.
Do you want to second it, and then we work on amending it from there?
Sure, I guess. I'll second it, but I did have one issue of the items that was brought up. I'm not necessarily interested in fungibility. I don't want to take money from infrastructure and put it into other bunches. But we need to, if we need to buy a new bus, I don't think that we should, divert that money and put it towards, employee costs. And that's the only concern that I have with the recommendation on looking for to make things more fungible. I do have other questions on on some of the ideas that were proposed, and thank you for making that. I think.
Johnny, can we take it one by one? Can I respond to that?
Sure.
Because I appreciate the concern. Let me give you two examples of what I'm referring to. One is, and I apologize, I actually should have included this. I misread my own writing. One thing that we need to consider as a board is whether or not when we put a new sort of tax or a new funding strategy on the table, that we have to have a framework so that we consider all the needs of the organization prior to taking any final votes. So because of that, we've gone to the ballot a number of times for capital investments without attaching, for example, operations and maintenance. And so my point here is that may be something, and again, the board would need to discuss this. We're only making a recommendation for the board and the staff to do some homework on it. But we may want to consider when we want to do a policy say in the future we don't do it again, or that we take a look at some specific pots of money. And let me just give you one that I'm very mindful of right now. Right now, our staff is in the process of negotiating with BART over what are the financial responsibilities that we have versus the financial responsibilities that BART has. BART has a very defined idea about what can be used. I'm sorry. Of what BART, a very defined idea of what can be, what is considered an expense because of BART, but we may feel differently about that. I want us to not feel obligated to respond in a standard way. I want us to think very critically about our ability to use resources when we think that's an appropriate way to do it. And I could give another example of the expressways that ASIM put the expressways on his list, the congestion management express lane, hot lanes. If it's an enterprise fund and you can't move the money, fine. But if we are allowed to invest money because we get revenue from like a express lanes allows us to spend more money on the express lanes and money we would have been spending on the express lanes, that can be moved into another, it could be a highway project, but giving us the ability to use money in different ways, to backfill money. And I think in some ways the staff's got a lot of different funding sources. It's difficult for them to do that, but I do think it should be a practice.
I'm okay with looking at the fungibility of things like what we need to discuss with BART. But we've actually made, for example, Measure A a lot more operating. It's geared more towards operating expenses now than rebuilding our highways. And you can see most of our budget it doesn't go to fix our highways. It goes to transit, for example. So I'm okay. So I will. I seconded the motion. I'll keep it in there. But I think we have to be careful about fungibility, not to neglect our highways and other infrastructure for the sake of fungibility. And I also had a couple more questions on some of the things that the auditor came up with. I thought that were interesting. The non-revenue vehicles, I think, needs to be potentially looked at as a, if they identified non-revenue vehicles, I want to know, if we're overdoing it on non-revenue vehicles or whatnot. If it needs to be right-sized, I don't know if I can include that. Okay.
Can I just address that?
Yeah,
Sure. Could you please? Yes. The majority of that project, and these are maintenance vehicles, these are road supervisor vehicles, these are bucket trucks for the light rail, way power and signal line. One of the ones that is in that group of projects was a street sweeper that they use for light rail to make sure that the track is clear. There's some paratransit vehicles in there. So and the other part of this is the average age of those vehicles is 14 and a half years old. So the replacement process is very methodical, it's very thought out, they base it on mileage, they base it on maintenance costs, they base it on lots of other things. I'm not saying we can't look at it, I'm just saying that the phrase non-revenue vehicle isn't always intuitive as to what those things might entail.
Okay, yeah, I just appreciate you looking at it, and that's all. I mean, I think it would give us a little more comfort that we're not, spending money on Cadillacs for our executives or something, right? So
That's absolutely not what it's for.
I understand. But I really appreciate your explanations of what those vehicles are. The other questions that I had, and I appreciate Supervisor Chavez's wanting to look into insourcing and versus contracting, and we actually did that in the city of San Jose, and in most cases, what we're contracting out is still being contracted out. What we were contracting in is still being contracted in. In fact, in one case, we decided that our workers' comp department got outsourced basically because it was getting done better being outsourced. So I'm all in favor of doing a comparative study as to what it would cost to do the work. I think it's important for us to get the best people on the job, and if it's insourcing, fine. If it's outsourcing, fine. And I think it's a good use of our time taking a look at how we're going to get the best value for our taxpayer dollars. I do want to warn about eliminating some routes to like Gilroy and Morgan Hill. A lot of the population, even the population from the city of San Jose, is moving further south, and they still work in Mountain View and Sunnyvale. And if we cut those routes, I think it'd be better to expand those routes because they cannot rely on the frequencies that we currently have, so they end up not using them. I do go down to Morgan Hill and Gilroy often, and I know the population there is not interested in cutting service. In fact, they want to increase service. So that being said, I think we are working on many of the things that we're recommending, like speeding up everything, speed. I personally have been looking at light rail, light signal, at least on First Street. I've implored our Department of Transportation to work with our VTA to make sure that at least on the First Street stretch that happens. And I've got those two sides talking together, and I think we need to do a lot more to speed up our transportation so that more people can rely on it as faster than actually being stuck in traffic.
So Johnny, I'm happy to, as part of the motion, make a point that we want to protect South County in particular. And I think the board has said that a few times, but let's just add it in here.
Yeah, that
so
would
as
be
we
great.
move to 9010, we recognize that South County has some unique needs.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And lastly, I think the best thing that works for getting more people on the rail is not necessarily trying to incentivize them. It's putting jobs where the light rail is or where the bus lines are, or taking the buses to the jobs. The number one reason people use like the Google buses is because it takes them to Google. And so making sure that the buses go where people need to work, I think will ensure that more people use it. Making sure, and I was going to give some kudos to Carl. Hopefully we take Google across the finish line and build it in San Jose right next to the transportation hub of the West Coast with Diridon Station. And if that comes, I'm hoping the ridership will actually increase as well. And lastly, we are actually working on a lot of different revenue sources. At least in my district, I've had a discussion today on about 2 separate building projects using VTA property that we are looking at some revenues, but even those revenues won't come into existence in enough time to help us with our budget concerns. It takes years to build housing. And so I appreciate the time of all of you for being involved, your ideas. I just gave you some kudos. You just missed them. Well,
if you send it
into
the tape, it's recorded.
I am done. Thank you.
Okay, so now my turn. the way I'm looking at how the motion was made, okay, in terms of thinking ahead in terms of how we're going to end up presenting something to the board, I kind of feel like I could take all of your suggestions and put them into 3 buckets, Cindy. The first bucket is, let's take specific action, and that's all around the service delivery, that's around the fares, around the voluntary retirement. We're saying, let's go for it, okay? I then look at another category where further examination should be done, okay? Not, and we have to figure out how to do that further examination, so it's not necessarily a specific action other than the further examination. It's not something that actually saves money or anything, but areas that we want to do a deeper dive in some way, shape, or form. The third one, I guess, which maybe I'm going to add to it or see how this fits into your thought process, and that was, I would call the thing more in terms of encouragement. And so, for example, I would put, aggressively, it's encouraging us to continually to continue our efforts in aggressively pursuing things such as the joint development. Because that's got some things in there. We're doing it. It's just encouraging and saying, let's keep that going. I would also want on this encouragement or messaging, one that I want to add onto the list is, you guys, we all kept talking about, and we kept struggling with this whole thing in terms of what is the future of public transportation. And the board was supposed to have had a workshop this last year. That didn't happen, so I would actually want to put on this encouragement that we need to start tackling that. We need to have the workshop, we need to have something, to, whether it's use of a team or something to try and really start looking at that, because the future, I think, Ronnie, a lot of what you comment on, we do need to understand what that future is. So I would add that to the list of encouragement, and encouraging the incoming chair to not let that one slip this time. Did I just say that out loud? The other one in terms of encouraging is I think we need to encourage staff to revisit some of our capital expansion plans. That's on my list. I think we've talked about this. You guys have brought that one up, and I didn't want that one to die either. But when we're looking at some of our expansions, so expanding service to East Ridge, it's specified, I'm going to use that as an example, as light rail. It's encouraging staff to kind of go back and revisit it, because we may have the capital to do that, but do we have the operational dollars to then operate it? And whether or not we would modify that to a dedicated guideway, but it's going to be bus instead of light rail. But looking at, and to me, both light rail extensions, I would like us to do it with a different lens of looking at what it's going to cost us long-term for operational and safe good repair or maintenance.
Madam Chair, on that point, may I just interject one short paragraph? So much of what we do is tied to our partners. As a member of the California Transportation Commission, as you know, we have allocated funds toward East Side Light Rail, and if we're changing the scope, cost, or schedule, in that case, that would be the scope. That means revisiting with our partners funds that were given for one version of a project, and if that's changed, that can cascade through different funding partners.
I know, I definitely, that's why I said, I think staff is already looking at some of this. I put it on my encourage, we could look at it under the examine if you would prefer. And I'm not looking at taking away services. It's a different vehicle for delivering the same service, is what I'm thinking of, if we can do that in a more cost-effective way. The next one I put on here is, and Cindy, you usually mention this one. I'm surprised it wasn't on your list, because I have this as, Cindy's going to mention this one, is again, encouraging us to look harder at a lot of these partner agreements. You mentioned BART as one example. I would add on there, even as the Caltrain chair, is again, I think we need to start looking at that as we look at the 8-cent sales tax, and what does that mean? And I think we need to be hard negotiators on that. So for example, maybe it's time with that sales tax passes, we no longer subsidize operation, because to me, subsidizing operation is steal from Peter to pay Paul. So I think we need to put, again,
If I could just respond to that one, because I'd like to include it in a different way. I think that is a policy discussion that should go before the board that says if there is a joint revenue strategy for Caltrain, that we will no longer subsidize it from our general fund. I think that's, and I think it's worth adding to the motion very formally for a discussion.
Okay. And I think that covers everything on my list, if you want to look at what you want to.
So let me reflect back, yeah, if you don't mind. On the encourage, what I would just say is that really is a policy consideration for the board. I think on the light rail extension, I think what I hear you saying is consider options for service provision. And I would rather use that term because I think that's going to be true, not so much about alignments, but about mode and strategy. So consider options for service provision. But I'm also going to say I think that's throughout the organization. But again, that speaks to whether or not we decide to have a bigger discussion about public transportation. On the future of public transportation, I do want to align that to the idea around future consideration for further analysis of what BTA is going to be 5, 10, 15 years from now. I think that's directly connected. And then on the joint development, I think I wouldn't even, what I would recommend on that is that there is value, I think, to asking the staff to come back with with some targets for joint development that are a little more refined now that we're understanding how we're doing that work a little bit better, because I do think there's a method for quantifying that is significant. And I would just want to add one other thing that, Johnny, you've raised this a few times, and I know that under our joint development policy we're considering it, but is also to make sure that we're looking at jobs and housing as part of our joint development. We are, but just to emphasize that. And I would include all of that in the motion.
Okay. And seconder of the motion?
Yeah, accept it.
Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, we got unanimous. I'm hoping that you've got.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, guys. So that we can conclude here, I'm hoping there's a couple things. Again, first, thank you very much for all your time and your energy in this. And I'm hoping that what you actually heard in the motion may be a little bit more encouraging than how you first walked into the room. Because I think what we just did is not only say, here's hard action we want them, we're recommending the board take. We're also, I think, through all of these additive things that Cindy was so eloquent in putting together, it is actually a way to give the board an appreciation for all the subject matter that has come before this group that we've had to talk about, et cetera. And even though we may not have drawn those to a specific conclusion, we think they merit going into and trying to address. So I'm hoping that everybody feels good about that motion that we just made. From an agenda point of view, are there any announcements? Comments? If not, then it is now 5:03 and the meeting is
I wasn't feeling bold enough.
See you at the turkey.
We'll see you all at the Silicon Valley Turkey Trot on Thursday.
So 5:03 meeting is adjourned. Thank you guys very much.